The Great War is sometimes thought of as an only European affair, and not a world war. It began on the continent after all, and Europeans felt the consequences of the conflict firsthand. But despite all the naysayers, World War I was truly a world conflict. There was fighting in the Atlantic and the Middle East, as I have previously discussed on this channel. But the war in Africa was much different from the one being fought in Europe. In the late 19th century, the Europeans looked to Africa to expand their already vast and costly empires. This event was known as the Scramble for Africa. Much of the land grab was seized by the two most dominant empires, the British and the French, with the Portuguese, Spanish, Belgians, and Italians all having colonies in Africa. Germany was also no different. I said before in my previous video that Otto von Bismarck originally denied Germany's claim to colonies in Africa. But after he was blackmailed by Karl Peters, and the luster of Lebensraum began to poison many German imperialist businessmen and citizens, Bismarck rescinded his stance on carving up Africa. Unfortunately, despite Germany's determination to declare war on the entire world, they also chose bad friends. The Ottoman Empire lost or was losing almost all their territories in Africa by the time the First World War even began, and Austria-Hungary could barely understand the languages of their own citizens. The empire housed Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and even Italians who they would eventually fight. All different peoples with different languages. To say adding African territory to their empire would have been a challenge is the understatement of the fucking millennia. Germany stood alone in Africa. There was a small chance that they could have turned to Italy since originally Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy were under the Triple Alliance prior to World War I. But once war broke out, Italy switched sides and joined Britain and France. I mean, what do you expect? It's Italy. They always choose the wrong side, and when things are looking sour, they switch to the winning team. They're fickler than Kamala Harris during her presidential run in 2020.
You also worked with them to oppose busing. And, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
We did it, Joe. You're gonna be the next president of the United States.
The Berlin Conference of 1884 had the European powers agree that if they were to go to war against each other in Europe, their holdings in Africa would remain neutral to each other. And then World War I happened, and Britain, France, and Germany broke these agreements. However, the governors of almost all the African colonies wanted to refrain from war, many of them having similar views that if they fought against each other, it would set a bad example to the African natives that they were trying to civilize, and it would upend the sanctity of white European civilization. But the Germans really wanted to go to war, because everyone was extremely bored of peace for the past 2 decades. So, Germany had 4 major African colonies: Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, which is Namibia, and German East Africa, which is Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. British and French High Command would simultaneously attack all 4 at relatively the same time. The first target would be Togoland. Togoland was sandwiched in between the British colony of the Gold Coast, which would become Ghana, and the French colony of Dahomey, which would become Benin. That area supplied the most slaves to the Atlantic slave trade for 400 years, but despite the horrors of slavery that permeated this region, the Germans were still able to build a modest economy in Togoland without the slave trade. They exported goods like yams, corn, and cotton, and eventually, by 1914, were completely financially independent from Berlin, and over 1 million inhabitants resided in the region. The governor of Togoland was Duke Adolf Friedrich of Mecklenburg from 1912 to 1914, and once war in Europe broke out, he expressed a great desire for neutrality. He told the European allies, in the interests of the natives, and to show the unity of culture of the white race, would keep the peace in West Africa, and let the big boys fight the war in Europe. This had the opposite effect he intended, and I guess the British and the French thought he was weak. Another factor in Togoland's perceived weakness was the fact that they had no standing army. They had a small police force called the Policemisters, consisting of 560 African men and a few white high-ranking officers. The British and French saw how minuscule the defending force was, and just couldn't resist the urge to take over some shit. Governor Adolf blah 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 said deuces, went on vacation, and left his deputy, Georg von Doering, in charge of the whole colony. Very inconvenient on the governor's part. This guy actually left as the British and French were invading from east and west, which is pretty hilarious. I have a boss that would do the exact same thing at work if he was under similar circumstances. The main target of the Allied invasions of German colonies would be the state-of-the-art radio communication towers that could communicate in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The capital of Togoland Lomé was the first target, and then the wireless station at Kamina. British commander Frederick Bryant RA was in charge of the Royal West African Frontier Force, which was tasked with taking Togoland. He sent Captain E. Barker to Lomé to discuss surrender terms with the Germans. The German diplomats asked for a 24-hour truce to come up with peace terms, but when Bryant returned, he found Lomé empty, and a German diplomat who remained in the city told Bryant that he was only authorized to relinquish 120 miles of land from the coast to the British. Bryant was like, what the fuck? The radio towers at Kamina is 170 miles inland. That's the whole reason why we were invading in the first place. He rallied troops together and sent them inland to take Kamina. On the 12th or 15th of August, the first shots between British and German troops of World War I were fired at each other, a week before the two great powers would battle each other in Europe. More fighting continued for more than a week, until Bryant and the French were close to Kamina, and on the 24th or 25th, the Germans blew up their own wireless station and surrendered the colony to the British and French. Bryant's success was well noted by his superiors, and he was showered with medals and even knighted by the king. The natives barely noticed a difference with the outcome of the invasion of Togoland, and life went on as normal, even as Togoland was partitioned between the British and the French in 1916. During, the man who was left in charge, while his piece of shit boss was on vacation, was held in French captivity for more than 3 years, and then interned in Switzerland for a year. He then returned to Germany and got married, only to die 2 years later from smoke inhalation. Not gonna lie, I do kinda feel bad for the guy. He was left to deal with a fucked up situation while his boss, who should be dealing with the defense of Togoland, is on vacation, plowing through prostitutes or whatever, and during loses the colony, ends up getting captured for 3 years, gets released, gets married, and finally gets a moment of peace and happiness, only to die shortly after at age 55, while Dick Adolf Johannes Pointy von Fuckface lives to the ripe old age of 95, dying away later in 1969. Which is pretty crazy when you think about it. He was born in 1873 and died in 1969. The world changed vastly in that time period. He went from seeing the birth of cars, TV, 2 world wars, the first nuke going off, the Great Depression, celebs like the Beatles, Elvis, and the Rolling Stones releasing their first albums, to seeing human beings in space for the first time. But he's still a jackass for going on vacation, while his colony that he was left in charge to protect fell to the British and French, and he should have at least had a standing army to defend the colony, but he didn't bother with any of that, because it had its pointy or whatever. Asshole. Cameroon, or Cameroon, as the Germans called it, name derives from Cameros, the Portuguese word for prawns, which were fished for in abundance around the region, and its climate seemed to really bother white people, so they nicknamed it the White Man's Grave. Which still didn't deter thousands of white people from coming to Cameroon. In the mid-19th century, France was swallowing up vast swaths of Central Africa. Great Britain looked to the blank spots on the European African maps and saw the region of Cameroon wasn't colonized yet, and he said, we haven't fucked up these people's lives yet. Should we do it? Yeah. Edward Hyde Hewitt was given treaty forms and sent to negotiate with tribal chiefs. He was at the Niger Delta when he received reports that Dr. Gustav Nachtigall, a scientist, explorer, and an Imperial German commissioner, was on a gunboat headed up the Wuri River to the capital Douala to sign treaty papers with the king and other chieftains. And that's how everyone started picking on Edward Hyde Hewitt, calling him names like Too Late Hewitt. No, actually, he forever became known as that. This man was probably never late to anything ever again, but people kept on calling him that anyways. Like, guys, that was one time, assholes. Britain would get only a third of the colony, and Germany would retain the rest, and then eventually Britain would relinquish all the territory to Germany. On July 12, 1884, the German Empire looked to Cameroon to set up shop, and surprisingly allowed the natives to maintain whatever rules, rights, customs, and trade through the German Douala Treaty of July 12, 1884, signed by Ndumbalobelable. Fuck, I don't know how to say that. I think Dumbbell. King Dumbbell. The treaty was signed by King Dumbbell, and there was peace and prosperity, and the white people respected the laws, territory, and culture of the natives, as they always do, and the black people taught the white people how to dance, and nothing bad ever happened between the two races ever again. The Germans immediately broke the rules of the treaty and were building infrastructure on lands outlawed to them. It's unfortunate because King Bell was said to have been a man of decency and dignity. He was also a successful businessman and political leader of his people. He had rivals, as anyone in that position would, but there wasn't a hint of brutality or reverence for violence. He tried to construct relationships with the colonial German politicians to strengthen relations between the two races, but to no avail. German colonists continued to break treaty laws and appropriate Cameroonian lands. King Bell would die December 1897, and his son Manga Ndumbbell I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. King Mega Dumbbell would take his place as king of the Douala people. Like his father, he had a keen and just business mind. By the time of his reign, his family controlled 70% of the cacao trade in Cameroon. He had also built a palace in 1905 called the Pagoda because of its design, which resembles Asian architect. Today it's a tourist attraction, so I don't know, maybe this video will inspire you to go to Cameroon, and now you have a first destination in the country to go see. You're welcome. Mega Dumbbell took his son Rudolf to Germany to protest the mistreatment of the Cameroonian tribes. This political ambition would eventually be absorbed by young Rudolf Douala Mangabell. Ooh, I got that one right. When he took power on September 2nd, 1908, after his father had died. Born in 1873 in Douala, Rudolf Douala Mangabell went to university in Germany partly because the German government agreed to pay for his schooling if his family gave their support for colonization. There's always got to be a fucking catch. He graduated with a law degree. Granted, there isn't much information on his time in Germany or his schooling. Regardless, he returned home and learned how to rule from his father until his father died and the young Rudolf Mangabell became the most notable king of the Bell family and Douala peoples. King Mangabell would work for the colonial administration in hopes of possible reform with his influence as the backbone. But of course, it was the German colonists, not King Mangabell, who had real control of the colonial policies. The German Cameroonian governor, Theodor Seitz, introduced actual apartheid to the colony when he was elected. He was forcibly relocating native tribes, including the Douala people, to segregated zones, and the Europeans had stolen the homes and businesses of the native Cameroonian tribes and rebuilt over them. Mangabell was propped up by his people to fight against the appropriation of the native lands by the German people. He said the Germans were breaking the rules of the treaty that his grandfather worked so hard to uphold. King Rudolf Mangabell believed in having appreciation for his mixed cultural heritage. He was baptized and loved his German influence, but he felt he couldn't escape his heritage because Africa was so ingrained in his being. He was also a king in a colonial state. He was the figurehead of his people, but their liberties and prosperity sadly was not in his hands. Regardless, if there was anyone who could build a bridge between the two races, it was him. The Cameroonians were willing to uphold the rules of the treaty, but of course, the Germans could not see blacks as equals and instead introduced apartheid to the colony before it even became a thing in South Africa. The German colonists responded to Mangabell's grievances by saying the natives carried and spread malaria and should be segregated. His concerns did find the ears of various social democrats in the Reichstag, who obviously weren't exactly hyped about colonialism and brutality against natives. Mangabell also sent his grievances to various European and African newspapers to spread word of the apartheid happening in Cameroon. One journalist that Mangabell was in contact with was Helmuth von Gerlach. But despite Mangabell's connections, there weren't enough to get Germany to rescind their apartheid policy. The Cameroonian king did not realize that his peaceful protest of the cruel colonial regime was about to be swallowed up by the eruption of, take a wild guess. Now that the Germans were at war, they had no time for what they believed were petty grievances and disloyalty. They found Mangabell while he was probably holding demonstrations in Douala and arrested him. Mangabell was found guilty of perceived disloyalty, the most bullshit random ass charge they could come up with, and sentenced him to death. Strangely, he was granted permission to have his cuffs removed, to leave and go say goodbye to his queen and princess. At this point, the man could have escaped with his family, but instead returned to meet his fate. On August 8th, 1914, he was hanged and made an example of by the German government, which is just sad. Me personally, I would have ran away with the girl and never looked back. But I guess he thought that if he showed loyalty, he might have been forgiven, since disloyalty was one of his charges. Or maybe he intended to die as a martyr, and if that's the case, he succeeded, since King Rudolf Mangabell is looked at as a national hero and symbol of independence for the Cameroonians. 2 days prior to Mangabell's execution, the French were already planning their invasion of Cameroon. The German colony was trying to tie up all their loose ends before the two allies invaded, but France's ambitions were entirely self-serving. Part of Cameroon used to belong to France, and they wanted those territories back. The more research I do on France in the First World War, the more I realize that their motivations for entering the war were purely territorial. They lost territory in Europe, in Alsace and Lorraine, in 1871, and now in 1914 they wanted it back. And they lost part of Cameroon to the Germans. The British commander in charge of the invasion of Cameroon was Colonel C.H.P. Carter. It took him at least 19 days for his plan to be approved and executed, and by the 25th of August, the British were invading at 3 points. One column moved on Mora, another on Yola, and the last at Garoua. All these attacks were repelled by the Schutztruppe. They had Carter sacked for his utter failure and sent in Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Cunliffe, who had been far more competent. It turned out that Cameroon would not be like Togoland, and the British and French would actually have to work together. Now, to my uninformed North American viewers, the British and the French fucking despise one another. They still do, but back in 1914, they might as well have just been fighting each other. The generals just talked shit, and it's one of the reasons why the Entente were so unsuccessful in the early days of World War I on the Western Front. This was also true in Africa. The Brits complained that the French would open too many attacks and then not finish them, hoping the British would clean up their mess, and the French said that the Brits took too many tea breaks, which is the most stereotypical complaint towards the British you could possibly come up with. General Dobell, who was put in charge of both British and French forces attacking Cameroon, had this to say about the French forces. Owing to the complex nature of the operations, it would be a matter of great difficulty for any British officer to act in concert with an officer of a different nationality. My experience of the French temperament leads me to believe that much of the methodical work that has to be performed at all hours of the day and night does not appeal to the characteristics displayed by that nationality. That's the most eloquent racism I've ever heard in my entire life. In a fucked up way, it's kind of beautiful. The British would set their eyes on the town of Douala, named after the Douala tribe and family. Douala also had one of the vital wireless communication towers that the British wanted destroyed. Much of the regular soldiers who did the fighting weren't white, but black Africans. For the most part, European politicians and generals didn't like the idea of blacks and browns killing white people. It didn't look good in their eyes, so they preferred to have blacks and browns kill each other instead. Now that's not to say that whites and colored individuals never fought each other, because they did, but it was still greatly preferred that this was avoided for the most part. The British and French West African forces numbered about 8,093. 5,426 came from Nigeria, 1,553 came from Ghana, 617 from Sierra Leone, and 137 from Gambia. These soldiers weren't expertly trained as the Schutztruppe, which were African natives that fought for the German colonial army, but they still outnumbered the defending Cameroon army 8-1. Cameroon had a standing army of 200 officers, 1,550 African Schutztruppe, and over 1,000 police, but most of these officers wouldn't do much fighting in the first year of the campaign. General Dobell would launch a naval attack on Douala. Multiple mines were laid out by the Germans in the waterways surrounding Douala, but they were all shot and blown up by Dobell's attacking force. He then sent an ultimatum to the city asking for its surrender. Douala was woefully unprepared for defense, since the German forces were spread thin due to the Entente attacking at so many different points throughout the colony. Also similar to Togoland, the Germans blew up the wireless communication tower themselves and surrendered the city on September 27, 1914. The British and French would loot Douala and establish their flag in the main government building within the city. Dobell's reward for taking the city was now he had to take the rest of the colony. Whenever you're good at your job, they always just reward you with more work. The year of 1915 in Cameroon was plagued by bitter jungle warfare between the opposing forces. The Entente would run into well-concealed machine gun fire from the Schutztruppe. Frontal attacks were suicidal, which is a recurring theme that's constant throughout the First World War. But unlike the Western Front, there was no no-man's land, which offered no cover. The soldiers had the African bush to conceal their movements and flanking maneuvers, and some battles even had the wildlife getting involved. One British lieutenant wrote, "We had a rather trying time. We crossed the Mungo River in canoes and then did a long and difficult march all throughout the night in dense forest country. About 5 in the morning, when it was just getting light, our advance party were on the point of stumbling on the German outpost when what should happen, but an elephant suddenly walked in between and scattered both our opposing parties in all directions. I was in the rear of our little column and was left in bewilderment, all our carriers dropping their loads and everyone disappearing into the bush. After a few minutes, we got our men together and our scouts went forward again to find the Germans had bolted from their outposts, but soon returned and opened fire on us." Bees would become a recurring antagonist in the war as well. One officer wrote, "Some of the poor fellows were so badly stung that they nearly died from pain and shock." The British and French would take Cameroon inch by inch through the dense jungle. Railways and towns were taken from the Germans, with the British gaining 5 locomotives, 50 pieces of rolling stock, stores, tools, fuel, and 2 airplanes from one town, and they would continue to see success like this as the invasion went on. One thing of significance was how willing the natives were to be guides and carriers for the Europeans. Native African soldiers were fiercely loyal to their white officers. General Gorges wrote, "The attitude of the natives was friendly, and the chiefs of the local tribes with many followers trekked in from the countryside, bringing presents of food for the troops. One wizened, white-haired old gentleman who came to pay his respects kept on muttering a curious jargon in melancholy tones, the interpretation thereof being that he desired eternal friendship with the British, and offered his tribe en masse as laborers and carriers. And of course, the Europeans were equally as friendly to the natives, and treated them fairly and justly. I can't do that joke a second time. The Europeans treated many of the natives horribly during wartime. The German colonial government ordered a scorched earth policy against the native Douala people to suppress an alleged people's war. Douala women were raped and killed by white German officers and soldiers, and at a town called Jabasi, a white German commander gave an order to execute every native in sight. I can't put it any simpler, but war crimes were being committed in Europe between whites, but in Africa, when you have whites who view their subjects as subhuman, you have a recipe for unimaginable cruelty. By March 1915, the Entente forces had fully established themselves in Cameroon. Douala was now the Allied headquarters in Cameroon. Fighting continued into the interior until the fortress of Mora was the last remaining bastion of German resistance in the colony. Mora was besieged on August 26, 1914, but several failed attacks from the British and French allowed the Schutztruppe to hold on to the territory. They had hunkered down on the slopes of the Mora region so they could overlook the area and prevent any incoming attacks. One joint British and French attack had them going up the mountain behind the German fortified positions. The Germans were firing the rifles above their heads as the British and French African colonial troops descended upon them. Surprise, surprise, it was repelled. Interestingly enough, just like the Western Front, there was a Christmas truce at Mora. Now, it wasn't as if the soldiers were ordered to stop fighting and engage in festive activities. Quite the contrary. The generals hated the fact that this happened organically in Europe and Africa and ordered the fraternization to stop. Another truce was called on New Year's Eve, which the British and Germans agreed to, but the French, being the petty assholes that they are, continued to shell the German positions on Mora. Sometimes I feel as if the British and Germans should have been allies against the French in World War I, and many soldiers of the time echoed this sentiment. By 1915, the Schutztruppe on the mountain, commanded by Major Ernest von Raben, were dying of thirst as the dry season was underway, and their water supply had become contaminated because of all the corpses lying around. But then the rainy seasons came, and the soldiers on Mora breathed a sigh of relief. Except the British and the petty Frenchmen, of course, and they were hoping the Schutztruppe would die of thirst. However, the German food supply was running low. The German command on the mountain would send raiding parties down the mountain to steal food from the British and French, and then woke up the next morning to find their croissants and tea missing. Now, as more of the colony fell to the British and French, that allowed German colonial troops to be sent to Mora to bolster the defending garrison, which is part of the reason why Mora held out for so long. But this was also double for the British and the French, as they had troops who could be sent to support the attacking force at Mora. Von Raben saw the situation was becoming dire and allowed any of his native African troops to leave the mountain and return to their families. But they all refused and stayed to defend Mora and him. More grab-and-run attacks would take place as the siege continued, but this strategy would only get the Schutztruppe so far. General Friedrich Hugh Cunliffe was the main allied commander of the British and French at Mora. He had been shelling and attacking the mountain for months, and finally it seemed as if his professional rival, von Raben, was beginning to break. General Cunliffe offered safety to the Schutztruppe, and they were allowed to return home to their families, and the German soldiers were offered internment in England. One of von Raben's requests to Cunliffe was that he received a payment of £2,000 to pay all his soldiers' wages. Cunliffe agreed, and von Raben surrendered, ending the last resistance in Cameroon. So, despite the brutality that many whites inflicted upon the native African soldiers, there were men like von Raben and Cunliffe that honored the soldiers' code despite color differences. Cameroon would be partitioned by the British and the French, as they always do with conquered territory.